Hello, and welcome to our video on reform movements during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. During the years from 1880 to 1910, so roughly after Reconstruction but before the First World War, numerous reform movements sprang up in the U.S. to ameliorate the problems caused by processes like industrialization and urbanization. These included the labor movement, the populist movement, the progressive movement, and the women's suffrage movement. These movements were, in general, successful in that they involved the passage of significant legislation and the ratification of constitutional amendments, so that changing societal attitudes translated into concrete policy change, thus impacting the lives of millions of American citizens, both at the time and in the future.
The first of the movements we're going to talk about today is the labor movement. In the early years of the Republic, efforts by tradesmen to create a better condition by refusing to work and trying to prevent others from working were considered criminal offenses. Journeymen, bootmakers, and shoemakers were put on trial in Philadelphia in 1806 and convicted of criminal conspiracy. This set the standard attitude towards organized work disruptions until 1942, when the principle of criminal conspiracy was rejected by the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. The New York Workingmen's Party lasted only a short time, forming in 1829 and disappearing in 1830. Demonstrating how politically unpopular the labor movement was for the early period of the U.S. history. However, it made public a new goal, the reduction of daily time of labor to 10 hours. Since the work week was still 6 days, this radical demand was for no more than 60 hours of work a week. The American labor force then changed profoundly during the nation's evolution from an agrarian society into a modern industrial state. The United States remained a largely agricultural nation until the 19th century. Unskilled workers fared poorly in the early U.S. economy, receiving as little as half the pay of skilled craftsmen, artisans, and mechanics. About 40% of the workers in the cities were low-wage laborers and seamstresses in clothing factories, often living in dismal circumstances. With the rise of factories, children, women, and poor immigrants were commonly employed to run machines. Some primary sources from the era demonstrates how deplorable conditions in the factories were, as well as how demeaning business owners' mindsets were towards their workers. Bertha Miller, a girl living in Thomasville, North Carolina, wrote, "I was 11 years old when I went to work in the mill. They learned me to knit. Well, I was so little that they had to build me a box to get up to put the sock in the machine. I worked in the hosiery mill for a long time and, well, then we finally moved back to the country, but me and my sister Molly finally went back up there in 1910, and I went to work in the silk mill. Molly went to work in the hosiery mill. We worked 12 hours a day for 50 cents. When paydays come around, I drawn $3. That was for 6 days, 72 hours. I remember I lacked 50 cents, having enough to pay my board." Not only did Factory Bertha work at hired children, it also forced them to work extremely long hours for very little pay, revealing just how little concerns there was or well-being of workers in industries at the time. This quote from a business owner at the time speaks for itself. "I regard my people as I regard my machinery. So long as they do my work for what I choose to pay them, I keep them, getting out of them all I can. What they do or how they fare outside my walls, I don't know, nor do I consider it my business to know. They must look out for themselves as I do for myself." There is no clearer statement of the era's disregard for workers as this comparison of human being to machinery, which is only useful for manufacturing goods and should not be cared for in any meaningful way. Labor unions in the United States were founded as representatives of workers in many industries recognized under U.S. labor law after this process of industrialization began. Their activities centered on collective bargaining over wages, benefits, and working conditions for their membership, and on representing their member in disputes with managements over violations of contract provisions. Larger unions also typically engage in lobbying activities in Congress. The trade union movement consisted of the collective organization of working people developed to represent and campaign for better working conditions and treatment from their employees and by the implementation of labor and employment laws from their governments. Unions began forming in response to the social and economic impact of the Industrial Revolution. National labor unions began to form in the post-Civil War era. The Knights of Labor emerged as the force in the late 1880s, but it collapsed because of the poor organization, lack of effective leadership, disagreements over goals, and a strong opposition from employers and government forces. Some of the most important leaders of the labor movement in the U.S. were Samuel Gompers, who was the first and longest-serving president of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, from 1886 to 1924. Eugene Debs, who founded the American Railway Union and organized the renowned Pullman strike on June 26, 1894, after the Pullman Palace Car Company cut the wages its workers received. And Margaret Dreer Robbins, who lobbied for minimum wages restrictions on work hours and limitation on child labor from 1907 to 1922. However, despite improving conditions for workers, there was an element of xenophobia involved in labor unions, as these were afraid that large influxes of unskilled immigrants would directly compete with American workers by being willing to work for very low pay, and since labor unions represented these workers, they were generally opposed to immigration.
The second reform movement we're going to discuss is the populist movement. One of the core parts of the populist ideology was the idea of producerism. According to producerism, members of society engaged in the production of tangible wealth are of greater benefit to society than, for example, aristocrats who inherit their wealth. This should make it clear that populists were generally opposed to disproportionate power that the elites came to have in late 19th century American society, and would thus work to increase the opportunities available to the rural poor who were ignored by wealthy urbanities. There were two key events that influenced the rise of the populist movement in the 1890s. Panic of 1873, which was a financial crisis that triggered the Depression in Europe and North America that lasted from 1873 until 1879. The panic was partly triggered by excessive speculation by bankers and other financiers, and yet the impacts of the panic affected the entire economy, which created widespread resentment against the bankers, who were seen as the root cause of the collapse. As an effect of the panic, average wages in the U.S. fell over 25%, and thousands of companies defaulted on approximately $1 billion of debt, which led to double-digit unemployment that lasted over a decade. Homelessness and malnutrition was also rampant. The Greenback Party, an American political party with an anti-monopoly ideology, which was active between 1874 and 1889. It was a precedent of the Populist Party that proved that populist politics could get some traction on the national level. This is because the party's support for currency that was not backed by gold bullion would result in increased prices for goods, which would mainly benefit farmers. Farmers were then seen as a marginalized group in society living in rural areas with very few privileges, and populists would also make small farmers the main beneficiaries of their policies. The general name for the movement that preceded and included populism between 1867 and 1896 was the Farmers' Movement. Within this movement, there were three periods. 1. The Grange, which was a secret order founded by Oliver H. Kelly in 1867 to advance the social needs and combat the economic backwardness of farm life. 2. The Alliance, which was an organized agrarian economic movement among American farmers that developed and flourished in 1875. 3. The Populists, which were the most important. By 1892, a large part of the farmers' organization with various industrial and radical orders was united in the People's Party, more generally known as the Populist Party, which had its beginnings in Kansas in 1890 and received national organization in 1892. The People's Party emphasized free silver, the income tax, 8-hour workday, reclamation of land grants, government ownership of railways, telephones and telegraphs, popular election of federal senators, and the initiative and referendum. The People's Party also opposed monopolies, campaigning on a platform designed to strengthen farmers and weaken the monopolistic power of big business like John Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel, banks, and railroad corporations. The party garnered 8.5% of the popular vote when presidential candidate James Weaver carried the states of Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, and Nevada in the Electoral College. Some of the policies that the Populist Party advocated for were the following. First was the unlimited coinage of silver, termed free silver. Supporters of free silver included owners of silver mines in the West, farmers who believed that an expanded currency would increase the price of their crops, and debtors who hoped it would enable them to pay their debts more easily. Second was the graduated or progressive income tax, which was a tax that rises in steps, with those having the highest income paying the highest percentage of tax. In this way, the wealthy paid their fair share, and income inequality would be reduced. Third was the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894, which slightly reduced the United States tariff rates, meaning that imports would be taxed less, and imposed a 2% income tax. The rationale for this policy was that many Americans and populist politicians saw the tariff-based tax system as protecting capitalists by immunizing their products from competition from imports. Some also resented the wealthy, who were sometimes seen as avoiding their responsibility to help pay for government services. Reducing tariffs and implementing an income tax would mean that the industries of the wealthy would not be protected from foreign competition, and that they would contribute more toward funding of the government. Fourth was banking regulation. In the first half of the 19th century, many of the smaller commercial banks within New England were easily chartered under applicable laws. The rise of commercial banking saw an increase in opportunities for wealthy individuals to become involved in entrepreneurial projects in which they would not otherwise involve themselves without a third party to guarantee a return on their investment. Fifth and finally, the Sub-Treasury Plan. The Sub-Treasury Plan was among the leading political issues of the 1890s in North Carolina and other states. The plan sought to revolutionize credit and marketing arrangements for staple crops, particularly cotton, by having the federal government lend money to farmers in rural areas.
Having already discussed the labor and populist movements, the third reform movement that we're going to explain today is the progressive movement. The ideology of the progressives could be summarized in two key tenets. First, that human nature could be improved through the application of regulations, incentives, and punishments. Second, that the power of the federal government could be manipulated to cause positive societal change. Thus, the progressive movement, which rose to prominence in 1900, strived to improve the living conditions of those who were least privileged in society through federal government policies in a way that was very similar to the populist movement of the 1890s. The difference was that the populists were generally lower class individuals from rural areas, while progressives were generally urban and middle class. Also, the latter was much more influential on national politics than the populist, with 3 elected presidents from 1900 to 1920 forming part of the progressive movement and none being a part of the populist one. There was an extremely wide range of policies implemented by progressives, which impacted several different entities and groups of people. First was policy regarding regulation of corporations. Until the progressive era, businesses in the U.S. were largely unregulated, even when this lack of regulation could result in damage to consumers' health and also damage to the economy as a whole. So progressives decided to change that and substantially expand the extent of federal government and regulation in order to improve the outcomes of the common American citizen. Thus, they implemented regulation of the food sector and in particular of the meat industry. Before progressives came along in the early 20th century, companies in the U.S. that were involved in the production of food were not required to maintain proper sanitation in their premises and were allowed to adulterate food so that it contained artificial additives created to boost quantity at the expense of quality. Even though the consumer didn't know about these additives, because labeling was not required either. Two main pieces of antitrust legislation were enacted by Progressive President Woodrow Wilson. First, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This clarified and strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, as the latter contained numerous loopholes that were exploited by large corporations. Second, the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. This created the Federal Trade Commission, a federal agency that would enforce the Sherman and Clayton Acts and gave the U.S. government a wider range of legal tools to combat corporate practices that undermine competition. However, progressives didn't just concern themselves with improving the lives of American citizens, as they also helped provide shelter to immigrants through settlement houses, as hundreds of shelters for the needy were established in response to an influx of European immigrants into the country and the urban poverty that resulted from industrialization and exploitative labor practices. The first of these was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Starr in Chicago in 1889, but they proliferated for long after that time. Importantly, progressives understood that if they could change the way in which policies were created and enacted by government, they could improve actual policy outcomes in the long term, so they worked on substantially reforming the American political system. One of the main problems with politics of the late 19th century and early 20th century were political machines. These were party organizations headed by a single boss or a small group of individuals that commanded enough votes to maintain political control of an administrative division like a city or county. The way it maintained this power was by giving out favors such as providing jobs or housing for constituents. But these political machines cared more about staying in power than about delivering effective governance, and thus became corrupted with individuals who did not represent the will of the people. In order to undermine the aforementioned political machines, progressives advocated for the expansion of direct democracy, so they wanted to increase the political participation of American citizens so that they, and not party bosses, would have the most influence on politics. At the federal level, the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, enacted in 1913, required that U.S. senators be directly elected by the voters of each state instead of being appointed by state legislatures. Numerous reforms were also implemented at the state level, especially under Wisconsin Governor Robert La Follette, that involved the expansion of direct democracy. These included primaries, which are elections in which members of the same party compete with each other in order for all of them to have a chance of becoming a candidate in their general election. Second, the initiative, which is a process for putting a proposition or proposed law on a ballot, usually by getting enough signatures on a petition to do so. Third, the referendum, which is a process by which the population directly votes on an initiative, which allows it to enact legislation when a state legislature is unable to do so. Fourth, recall, which is a process that gives voters the power to remove elected officials from office through a petition and a vote, even before their term ends. Lastly, progressives attempted to reform society by attempting to change behaviors that they disapproved of, as well as by reducing the number of individuals they considered, quote, undesirable. Not only did some of these policies fail, but some were also extremely racist, which shows that even though, in general, the movement aimed to improve the lives of people, there was a dark side to it as well. The most prominent of progressive social policies was prohibition. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the U.S. was legally prohibited after the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, at the culmination of the temperance movement which arose since the early 1820s and 1830s. It largely failed as it was circumvented by bootleggers and gangsters who smuggled and sold liquor in the U.S. even after the amendment was ratified by Congress. The most regressive of progressive policies was the movement support for eugenics. This consisted of the control of human reproduction through processes like forced sterilization, in which people deemed, quote, defective or unfit are biologically prevented from procreating, and euthanasia, in which the lives of these same people are terminated if they are in a coma or suffer from an incurable disease. Some progressives considered the preservation of their race or ethnic group a priority, so the popularity of eugenics in general increased substantially in the US during the Progressive era. Sterilization acts forcing some groups of people to become sterile passed in 30 US states at the time. Regarding racial minorities, one of the only positives during this era was the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909 by African American sociologist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. This organization was dedicated to fighting for the rights of African Americans in the US, and they would achieve substantial gains for them down the road, especially during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
And, finally, the fourth main reform movement in the US from 1880 to the 1910s was the women's suffrage movement. For all of American history up until this point, women did not enjoy the right to vote. Even after the rights of African Americans were expanded after the Civil War. Thus, the women's suffrage movement was a struggle for the right of women to vote and run for office. The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, both founded in 1869, were the main suffrage organizations in the U.S. during the 19th century. In 1888, the first international women's rights organization formed, the International Council of Women, with the help of American suffragettes Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They pursued the right to vote in different ways, but by 1890 it became necessary to combine efforts to keep the cause alive. The National Women's Suffrage Association was created by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this time the women's rights movement split into two groups after the issue of suffrage for freed American men. One of the precedents for granting women the right to vote was the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which granted African American men the right to vote by declaring that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1920, provides men and women with equal voting rights. The amendment states that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any account of sex. Although this equality was implied in the 14th Amendment, which was established in 1868, most of the states continued to restrict or prohibit women's suffrage until the efforts of women during the early 20th century paid off and the 19th Amendment was passed. There were many important women who participated in this suffrage movement. Among the most important was Susan B. Anthony, the leader and founder of the women's suffrage movement. Anthony believed that suffrage and education were where the focus of women's organizing energies should be, and that if those two areas were successful, women would have tools needed for everything else. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an early women's rights activist who wrote the Declaration of Statement. This document, modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence, listed the grievances that women had against men who had denied them fundamental rights such as the right to vote. Alice Paul, who, after the declaration of the 19th Amendment in 1920, devoted her life to creating additional measures that would benefit women in their fight.
And finally, Emmeline Pankhurst, a suffragette who became recognized after throwing herself in front of the king's horse at Epsom. Some speculate she did this in order to draw attention to the movement. Davidson died 4 days later due to the fatal injuries.
This cartoon is titled Election Day, and it mocks the traditional roles of man and woman in a household. Now, let's analyze it. It was published when the movement was in full swing, and it pictures a woman ready to walk out the door in order to vote. Her husband is staying at home and taking care of the children. Instead of the husband partaking in voting, now it's the wife, reflecting how the women's suffrage movement was fundamentally changing the standing of women in society at the time. It granted them one of the most basic rights that citizens must be able to exercise in a democracy.
Today, we've learned a lot about some of the most important areas in U.S. history that still impact our lives today. The labor, populist, progressive, and women's suffrage movements all fundamentally changed the way that government functions and the quality of life of immigrants, workers, consumers, and farmers today, as well as several key pieces of legislation and even constitutional amendments were passed to change the federal government in order for it to become a force for good.
However, the movement did have its negative aspects, as the progressive movement also came with a rise in support for eugenics, and the labor movement involved a substantial amount of xenophobia against unskilled immigrants, which proves that no historical period is completely good or completely bad, and one must always take this into account when studying the past.
Thanks for watching. We hoped you learned a lot and enjoyed the video.